My name is Julia Holloway, and I'm 32 years old. Last Saturday, at my sister's engagement dinner, my parents introduced me to the groom's family. My mother wore her usual polite smile and said, "This is our other daughter, Julia. She makes a living cleaning homes." Without hesitation, my father nodded and quietly added, "We've stopped expecting much from her." There were 23 people seated around the table. The white tablecloths were spotless, and the baskets of fresh bread had just been served. Then the groom's mother, a woman I had only met once before during a business meeting 18 months earlier, slowly placed her fork on her plate. She looked directly at me and asked in a low voice, "Wait, are you the same Julia?" The color instantly disappeared from my mother's face. What happened over the next 40 minutes changed my family forever. I honestly don't think things will ever return to the way they were. But before I tell you about that unforgettable evening, you need to understand everything that led up to it. That dinner wasn't the beginning of the story. It was simply the moment years of tension finally exploded. The fuse had been burning for an entire decade. Welcome to my channel. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support truly means a lot. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always enjoy reading your messages. Now let me take you back 10 years, to the moment my family decided I was no longer worth investing in. I grew up in Carver, Indiana, a small town of about 9,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else. People recognized your father's car, and even your mother's favorite casserole recipe. My father, Gerald, spent 30 years working for the same insurance company. He became a regional claims manager when he was 31 and stayed in that exact position for the rest of his career. My mother, Diane, was incredibly talented with numbers. She could calculate payroll in her head and managed the bookkeeping for 3 local businesses before I was born. But once she became pregnant with me, my father encouraged her to leave her career and stay home with the family. She agreed and never returned to work. Looking back, I don't think she ever truly accepted that sacrifice. It felt as though she quietly resented all of us for it, not only me, but even my younger sister. My sister, Paige, is 4 years younger than I am. She's 28 now and works as a marketing coordinator in Indianapolis. In just 3 years, she earned 2 promotions. Every time she moved up, my mother would call me, not to celebrate together, but to make sure I knew exactly how well Paige was doing. The wall in our living room reflected my parents' priorities perfectly. It displayed Paige's diplomas, her Employee of the Quarter award, and her college achievements. My side of the wall ended with a single photo from my college graduation. As far as my parents were concerned, earning my business degree was the last sensible decision I ever made. No matter where we were, church, the grocery store, or a family gathering, my mother always introduced us the same way. She would proudly announce Paige's newest accomplishment, pause for a moment, and then casually say, "Julia is still doing her own thing." My father never interrupted or corrected her. He never added context or defended me. Instead, he simply stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring down at the floor. It didn't take me long to realize that silence can sometimes be another form of agreement. Whenever my mother introduced us, the pattern never changed. She would proudly announce, "Paige just received another promotion," pause for a moment, and then casually add, "Julia is still doing her own thing." My father never stepped in to explain or defend me. He stayed silent, his hands buried in his pockets, staring at the floor like someone simply waiting for the moment to pass. It didn't take me long to understand that silence can sometimes speak louder than words. I learned that lesson early. The summer I turned 22, I had just earned my degree in business administration and was excited about the future. My mother, however, had already chosen a different path for me. Without asking my opinion, she enrolled me in the state university's MBA program, paid the enrollment fee, told my father's coworkers about my plans, printed the course catalog, and placed it on my bedside table as if the decision had already been made. One Thursday evening, I invited her to sit with me at the kitchen table and calmly told her that I wasn't going to attend. "I'm starting a commercial cleaning business," I explained. I had prepared a detailed business proposal containing market research, financial projections, startup costs, and a 12-month cash flow forecast. She never even opened the binder. For 14 long seconds, she remained completely silent while I counted each tick of the clock behind her. Finally, she looked at me and said, "So your big dream is cleaning toilets?" Just then my father walked in from the garage. After hearing enough of the conversation, he frowned and said, "I already told Jim at work that you were starting your MBA." Paige was spending the evening at a friend's house. Later that night, she sent me a short text that read, "Mom says you're overreacting." Only one person showed genuine interest in my business plan, my grandmother, Ruth. She's 78 today, but back then she was 68 and still as sharp as ever. Sitting on her porch, she carefully read every page before asking, "Where do you expect this business to be by the 3rd year?" When she finished, she reached into her savings and handed me $800. Along with the money, she gave me a white cotton handkerchief she had embroidered herself with the initials RH. As she placed it in my hand, she smiled and said, "Keep this for the difficult days." That same evening, my mother made it clear that if I wanted to spend my life scrubbing floors, I would have to do it without a single dollar from her. From that moment on, she stopped supporting me financially. I quietly packed my business binder into my backpack, got into my car, and drove 4 hours to Indianapolis. I didn't argue or try to change anyone's mind. I simply left. My first apartment was a tiny studio that rented for $475 a month. It had only one window, and the old radiator banged loudly every night around 3 in the morning, as if someone were trapped inside the walls. I bought a used white van for $2,200. It had no company logo, and the air conditioner seemed to work only on Tuesdays and Fridays for reasons I never understood. My very first client was a small dental office on Meridian Street. It had 3 treatment rooms, a waiting area, and a bathroom with mint green tiles. They paid me $200 each week, and every morning at 5 o'clock I cleaned the office myself. My afternoons were spent visiting businesses and asking for work, while my evenings were dedicated to bookkeeping at my kitchen table. After 6 months, I had secured 4 regular contracts. I worked every single day of the week, and my shoulders hurt so badly that even sleeping didn't make the pain disappear. By the end of my first year, the business had generated $62,000 in revenue, leaving me with an $11,000 profit. That was also the year I hired my first employee, Maria, a hardworking single mother from Guatemala. She arrived 15 minutes early for every shift and never once complained about the work. Even today, she's still part of my company. Every Sunday, I called Grandma Ruth. She never asked vague questions. Instead, she wanted real details. How many clients do you have now? What's your closing rate? Have you arranged liability insurance yet? She listened with genuine interest because she truly believed my dream could succeed. Every other week, I called home. My mother usually answered the phone, and every conversation followed the exact same pattern. Every other week, I called home, and the conversation rarely changed. "Are you finally ready to come back?" my mother would ask. "Not yet, Mom," I'd reply. She would immediately shift the topic. "Paige is doing great at her new job. Tell her congratulations," I'd say. My father never came to the phone. By my 3rd year in business, something happened that almost made me call my mother to share my success. Almost. But by then I understood that almost never meant anything in my family. That year became the turning point. I secured a contract to maintain a 12-story office building on the north side of Indianapolis. The agreement was worth $340,000 a year. Soon after, I opened a second branch, expanded my team to 38 employees, and my company's annual revenue climbed past $1.4 million. At only 25 years old, I was running a business that cleaned more commercial space each week than many people would ever see in a lifetime. Excited, I called my mother. "Mom, I just signed a contract worth $340,000 a year." There was a brief silence. Then she asked, "So, how many people are you sending out to mop floors now?" 38, I answered. 38 people mopping floors, she replied. "Well, that's something." Before I could respond, My father's voice came over the speakerphone. Your sister was just accepted into her company's leadership program. I sat quietly in my office, an actual office now, with a proper desk, a filing cabinet, and a framed picture of Grandma Ruth resting on a shelf nearby. My eyes drifted toward the stack of business cards I had recently designed myself. They were navy blue with a clean, professional font, displaying the company name, Holloway Commercial Services, along with the slogan, Excellence in Every Detail. I had spent 2 full days choosing the perfect shade of blue. That phone call was the last time I voluntarily shared news about my business with my parents. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no argument or final goodbye. I simply realized there was no point in knocking on a door that would never open. When you proudly tell someone you've earned a contract worth $340,000 and all they hear is mopping floors, the message becomes impossible to ignore. They've already decided who you are, and no amount of success will change the picture they've created in their minds. For the next 7 years, my parents continued believing the version of me they had chosen to believe, and I let them. Time passed. Holloway Commercial Services expanded into 14 states. My workforce grew to 283 employees, and annual revenue reached $18 million. We began providing services for hospitals, universities, corporate headquarters, and government facilities. Our employee retention rate reached 87%, one of the best in the industry. I also created an ESL training program for employees, and several competing companies later tried to copy the model. I still lived in Indianapolis. I drove a 2019 Honda Accord and owned a downtown condominium that I had purchased outright with cash. Even now, I kept a bottle of homemade lemon vinegar cleaner on my desk because its familiar scent reminded me of where everything had started. None of my success was hidden. My company had its own website, I maintained a LinkedIn profile, and there was even a short Wikipedia page about the business that someone else had created. My parents never bothered to look at any of it. Then one afternoon, Paige called. It was the first time I had heard from her in 4 months. Her name appeared on my phone while I was reviewing a proposal for a new facility, and for a moment, I simply stared at the screen before answering. My phone lit up with Paige's name. I almost ignored the call, but at the last second I answered. I'm engaged, she said excitedly. Garrett Ellsworth's family is hosting an engagement dinner next Saturday. Mom wants you to come. I paused before asking, does Mom actually want me there, or do you? Paige sighed. Does it really matter? Grandma Ruth will be there, and she specifically asked if you were coming. That was enough for me. Whenever Grandma Ruth asked for me, I never said no. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and searched for the Ellsworth family. The name immediately caught my attention. Ellsworth Property Group owned more than 200 commercial properties throughout Indiana and Ohio. I knew the company well. 18 months earlier, my business had secured the cleaning contract for 47 of their buildings, a deal worth $3.8 million annually. It was the biggest contract my company had ever signed. The agreement had been approved by the chairwoman of the board, Catherine Ellsworth, the groom's mother. I stared at the screen for several minutes. The afternoon before the dinner, I stood alone in my office, looking at the spray bottle on my desk. It held a simple mixture of lemon juice, white vinegar, and water. The exact formula I had mixed in my tiny apartment 10 years earlier when professional cleaning products were beyond my budget. I unscrewed the cap and inhaled the familiar scent. The sharp citrus smell instantly brought back memories of 5 o'clock mornings, sore muscles, and scrubbing mint green bathroom tiles. It reminded me of where everything had started. That evening, I chose my clothes carefully. I wore a navy blue blouse that happened to match my company's logo, though no one at the dinner would know that. I paired it with black slacks, comfortable flat shoes, and the only jewelry I wore, a delicate gold chain Grandma Ruth had given me for my 30th birthday. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, and I certainly wasn't trying to prove anything. I dressed exactly as I did on any normal workday, practical, simple, and ready for business. On Saturday morning, I called Grandma Ruth. I'm heading your way, I told her. Drive safely, sweetheart, she replied. After a brief pause, she added softly, and Julia, don't let your mother make you feel small. Her voice had grown weaker over the past year because of her heart medication, and hearing that worried me. I got onto Interstate 7 and headed east toward Carver. The drive would take about 3 hours, with endless stretches of Indiana farmland, harvested cornfields, and radio stations that faded in and out like old friendships. Those 3 hours gave me plenty of time to think about how much of myself I wanted to bring into that room. I knew Catherine Ellsworth would be there, and I was certain she would recognize me. What I didn't know was how she would react, or how my parents would respond once she did. I wasn't planning to reveal anything or create a scene. The only reason I was making that trip was to spend time with my 78-year-old grandmother, whose health was slowly declining. Everything else happened on its own. The dinner was held at the Birchwood, a farmhouse-style restaurant just outside Carver. It featured exposed brick walls, elegant table settings, fresh bread served in baskets, and the kind of menu where a single pork chop cost $42. I arrived at 6:55 that evening, 5 minutes before dinner. My mother's silver Buick was already parked near the entrance, with my father's coat visible through the back window. Paige's white SUV sat a few spaces away, proudly displaying a "Just Engaged" sticker that looked perfectly centered. The private dining room was located at the back of the restaurant. A long oval table had been prepared with 23 place settings, neatly folded napkins, warm lighting, fresh bread, and glasses of water waiting for the guests. As I stepped inside, my mother greeted me. She was wearing a plum-colored dress and a necklace I had never seen before, probably something she had bought for the occasion. She hugged me briefly, gripping my shoulder tightly before stepping back. "You look comfortable," she said, her eyes quickly examining my blouse and shoes. She smiled politely, but the expression never truly reached her eyes. My father, Gerald, stood just behind her. Instead of giving me a hug, he extended his hand for a handshake and simply said, "Glad you could make it." As I stepped farther into the room, Paige hurried over, her engagement ring sparkling beneath the lights. She wrapped me in a warm hug, something I hadn't expected. "I'm really happy you came," she said before introducing me to her fiancé, Daniel. He greeted me with a confident handshake and an easy smile. "This is my older sister," Paige said. "She lives in Indianapolis." She didn't mention my work, and I noticed it immediately. Across the room, Grandma Ruth caught my eye. She looked weaker than the last time I had seen her, sitting quietly in her wheelchair with a knitted sweater buttoned neatly to the top. The moment I reached her, she held out her hand. "There's my favorite girl," she whispered with a smile. I sat beside her, grateful for the comfort of her presence. The appetizers arrived, and conversations spread across the room. My mother moved from guest to guest, proudly introducing every member of the family along with their accomplishments. One relative was praised for years of public service, another for graduating at the top of a university class, and someone else for receiving a promotion. When she reached me, she simply continued walking. It wasn't cruel enough to attract attention, but it was enough for me to notice. A few minutes later, the groom's father smiled warmly and asked, "So, Julia, what line of work are you in?" Before I could answer, my mother replied, "She's in the cleaning business." Her tone made it sound insignificant, as though the subject wasn't worth discussing. I nodded politely, without correcting her. Grandma Ruth quietly squeezed my hand beneath the table, reminding me without words that she was still on my side. Moments later, the room fell slightly quieter as the groom's mother entered. She greeted everyone with calm confidence before stopping in front of me. For a brief second, recognition flashed across her face. "I know you," she said thoughtfully. "We've met before, haven't we?" I smiled politely. "Yes, we have." The atmosphere changed, although no one else seemed to notice. "Here's your rewritten script with the same meaning, similar length, and a completely fresh wording." The company managed commercial buildings, office towers, medical facilities, and mixed-use properties spread across 4 different states. They needed one reliable contractor to provide cleaning services for 47 locations. The agreement was valued at $3.8 million every year. I arrived wearing my navy blue suit, carrying a carefully prepared 40-page proposal. I had invested 3 full weeks putting it together. It included detailed service packages, staffing strategies, quality assurance procedures, and cost comparisons. I even printed 5 copies and rushed to a FedEx just before midnight so they could be professionally spiral-bound. Catherine led the meeting. 6 people sat around the conference table, yet she asked more questions than everyone else combined. She wanted to know our employee retention rate, 87%. She asked about our training process, 40 hours of onboarding, monthly follow-up meetings, and ESL assistance. Then she asked why I had started the business in the first place. I answered honestly. I told her that when I was 22, I cleaned my very first office using a borrowed mop and a spray bottle. That experience made me promise myself that people who perform this kind of work should never feel invisible or overlooked. She didn't smile. Instead, she quietly wrote something in her notebook. After I signed a contract, she walked me to the elevator. Before the doors closed, she said, "I've approved plenty of contracts, Julia, but this is the first time I felt that the person across the table cared more about the people doing the work than about the profit." I carried those words with me for months. It was the first time someone with real influence had looked at everything I'd built and recognized it for what it truly was. My own parents had spent 10 years without ever saying anything like that. A complete stranger managed to do it in just 15 minutes. Back at the family dinner, the main course had arrived, pan-seared salmon with roasted vegetables and ratatouille, but hardly anyone paid attention to the food because the conversation had shifted toward careers. Robert Ellsworth broke the silence. "So, Diane, you must be incredibly proud of both your daughters." My mother gently placed her fork on the table and tilted her head. I knew that expression well, that combination of a polite smile and careful calculation. She was preparing her performance. "Oh, Paige is definitely our superstar," she said. "She's already been promoted twice in only 3 years, and her company just trusted her with its biggest client." She lightly touched Paige's arm. Paige smiled with a hint of embarrassment, though not enough to stop the praise. Then my mother paused, allowing the silence to work in her favor before changing direction. Julia chose a different kind of career. Gerald didn't need any encouragement. Leaning toward Robert as though sharing a private joke, he added, "She started cleaning offices after college. We assumed it would only be temporary." He gave a small laugh. 10 years later. He let the sentence fade away with a shrug, as if the ending wasn't important enough to say aloud. Megan glanced at me. Garrett kept staring at his plate. Robert stopped chewing. I calmly cut another piece of salmon, ate it, swallowed, and took a sip of water. Then, from the far end of the table, Grandma Ruth placed her fork down firmly enough that it clinked against her plate. "Julia is doing just fine, Diane." Without missing a beat, my mother kept her perfect smile. "Of course she is, Mom. Nobody said she wasn't." That was always her style. She never made accusations directly. Instead, she buried people beneath carefully crafted implications until they could hardly breathe. Catherine Ellsworth lifted her glass of water, then quietly set it back down without taking a sip. For nearly half a minute, she hadn't taken her eyes off my mother. Diane never even noticed. She rarely paid attention to the people who were actually watching. After the main course, and before dessert was served, I excused myself and headed to the restroom. It was located down a narrow hallway with cream-colored walls and a framed watercolor painting of a barn, the sort of artwork you only ever find in restaurants or dental offices. When I came back out, Gerald was waiting in the hallway. His hands were buried in his pockets, his shoulders slightly slumped. He looked like someone who had been standing there for a while, unable to decide whether he should leave or stay. "Hey, Jules, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad." He shifted awkwardly from one foot to the other. "I know your mom can be difficult sometimes, but she really does mean well." Does she?" He parted his lips as if he wanted to continue. A brief expression crossed his face, not quite confidence, but something close to it. It looked like a man reaching for a doorknob in complete darkness, unsure of what waited on the other side. His fingers absent-mindedly twisted his wedding band once, then again. Before he could speak, my mother's voice cut through the hallway from the dining room. "Gerald, could you bring another bottle of wine?" Her tone was sharp and absolute, the way someone calls back a dog that has wandered too far from home. He blinked. "I should get back." Without another word, he turned and walked away. He never glanced back. I remained in the hallway, watching him disappear into the warm glow of the dining room. In that moment, I realized that was probably the closest Gerald Holloway would ever come to standing up for me. A broken sentence in a quiet hallway. That was all he had to give. And even that wasn't enough. I'd stopped expecting more from him years ago. I stepped into the restroom and washed my hands. The soap smelled of fresh lemons, sharp, clean, and strangely familiar. The scent hit me the way an old song does when it suddenly plays in a grocery store years after you thought you'd forgotten it. I dried my hands, took a slow breath, and returned to the table. As I sat down, Grandma Ruth gently rested her hand on my wrist. That was her way of asking if I was all right without saying a single word. I gave her a small nod. She quietly let go. Paige had wandered over to the window, talking with Garrett. Her phone was lying face down beside her bread plate. A moment later, the screen lit up. A notification appeared from a group chat titled, "Wedding Planning Ringed." I never picked up the phone or touched it. I didn't have to. The preview was clearly visible against the white tablecloth, and my eyes worked just fine. The first message, sent by Diane 2 hours before dinner, read, "Whatever happens, don't let Julia start talking about her business tonight. The Ellsworths don't need to think our family includes a cleaning lady." An hour later, Paige had replied, "Already taken care of. I introduced her as my sister from Indianapolis. That's all." I read both messages twice before the screen went dark. There were 23 people sitting in that dining room. 3 of them had planned in advance to make sure I stayed small. It wasn't an accidental comment or an awkward mistake. It had been organized, written down, time-stamped. I calmly picked up my glass, took a drink of water, and set it back on the table. Grandma Ruth watched my face closely. From where she was sitting, she couldn't possibly have seen the phone. But she noticed something anyway. In my expression, the tension in my shoulders, the way I held my glass. "You all right, sweetheart?" "I'm fine, Grandma." I paused. "I'm just seeing things more clearly now." She didn't ask another question. She never did. After 78 years of life, Ruth had mastered the difference between moments that needed words and moments when silence carried far more meaning. A few moments later, Paige returned. Without checking the notification, she picked up her phone, slipped it into her purse, and smiled at me. It was an effortless, cheerful smile. The kind of smile that had never once wondered what someone else had to sacrifice to earn it. The dessert menus were passed around. I left mine closed. Under the table, I reached into my wallet and pulled out a white cotton handkerchief. 10 years of use had softened the fabric. The embroidered initials had faded from deep navy to a muted blue-gray, but I could still feel the stitching beneath my thumb. RH. Grandma Ruth had placed that handkerchief in my hand the night I left Carver. I'd carried it every single day since then. It stayed with me through my tiny studio apartment, my first client, the opening of my second location, hiring my 50th employee, and later managing my 100th building. It had been in my pocket when I signed the Ellsworth contract. And it was still there tonight. As I traced the worn embroidery with my thumb, my thoughts returned to those group messages. 2 texts. 6 short sentences. 10 years of assumptions, carefully arranged and confirmed as casually as making a dinner reservation. This wasn't ignorance. They knew exactly who I was. They simply preferred to plan around it. They had agreed on a script beforehand. Don't let Julia talk about her business. As though my career were something shameful that had to be hidden before guests arrived. I didn't suddenly decide to embarrass anyone. I didn't create a strategy or rehearse some dramatic speech. I made one simple decision. A decision I should have made 10 years earlier. I would never make myself smaller again. If someone asked me a direct question, they would receive a direct answer. No minimizing my success. No changing the subject. No pretending to be less than I was just to protect people who had never protected me. Across the table, Catherine caught my eye. She slowly stirred cream into her coffee with the careful precision of someone who missed nothing. "How's life in Indianapolis?" she asked. "Busy," I replied. "The good kind of busy." She nodded, took a quiet sip of coffee, and said nothing else. But I could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes. The woman Diane had described didn't match the woman Catherine had met in that boardroom. The pieces simply didn't fit. And Catherine Ellsworth wasn't the kind of person who ignored numbers that refused to add up. If you've ever sat at a family gathering feeling unseen, like the version of you everyone talked about no longer matched the person you'd worked so hard to become, then make sure you subscribe right now. Because what happens next at this dinner is the entire reason I'm sharing this story, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Dessert hadn't even been served when my mother rose from her chair. She gently tapped her knife against her wine glass.
Clink, clink.
The conversation stopped instantly. I'd like to say a few words. She placed one hand over her heart, and right on cue, her eyes began to glisten. I'd watched her perform this routine countless times, at funerals, church dinners, PDA meetings, whenever she needed people on her side. Diane Holloway could produce tears as effortlessly as someone ordering a rideshare. She looked toward Paige. When I look at Paige, she began, I see everything I ever hoped my daughter would become. For the next 2 minutes, every sentence revolved around Paige.
Her college degree.
Her successful career. Her composure under pressure. Her kindness. Her accomplishments. It was Paige.
Paige. Paige.
Every compliment stacked neatly on top of the last, building a monument to the daughter who had followed the path my mother had always imagined. Not once during the entire speech did she mention my name. Robert Ellsworth shifted slightly in his chair. He looked at me, then back at Diane. He struck me as the type of person who noticed what others deliberately left out. When my mother finally paused to catch her breath, he calmly asked, And your older daughter? Julia, isn't it? She's here tonight, too. For just a moment, my mother hesitated before quickly recovering. She looked at me the way someone notices a stain on a tablecloth they were hoping no one else would see. This is our other daughter, she said with a cheerful smile. She cleans houses for a living. She said it as though it were an adorable little detail, an amusing footnote attached to an otherwise perfect family story. Before anyone else could speak, Gerald chimed in from across the table. We've pretty much given up on her. He laughed at his own comment. No one joined him. Silence filled the room for 2 long seconds. Then Catherine Ellsworth slowly placed her fork on her plate. It was the careful movement of someone who had already decided that whatever happened next mattered. 23 people sat around that table. Catherine didn't blink. The silence stretched for another 3 seconds, long enough for the waiter to stop midway through pouring water into Robert's glass. Megan stared down at her plate. Garrett quietly rested his hand on Paige's knee beneath the table. I noticed everything. Uncle Tom cleared his throat into his fist. Finally, Catherine turned toward me. Her voice remained calm and steady, the exact same tone she'd used months earlier in that Columbus boardroom while asking about employee retention. Julia, she said, I'd love to hear more about your cleaning business. My mother jumped in before I had the chance to answer. Oh, it's nothing special, Diane said, her smile widening into the emergency version she always used whenever she felt control slipping away. She goes into people's homes and cleans them. She's been doing that ever since college. Catherine never even looked at her. Instead, she kept her eyes on me. I'd rather hear Julia answer that herself, if you don't mind. The sentence landed in the middle of the table like shattered glass. Polite.
Direct.
Impossible to misunderstand. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I own a commercial cleaning company, I replied. We provide cleaning services for office buildings, hospitals, and universities. My mother's smile immediately tightened. She always makes it sound so formal. Catherine ignored the interruption. How many states do you operate in? 14. Across the table, Gerald's fork tapped against his plate. He hadn't intentionally moved it. His hand had simply twitched. And how many employees? 283, as of last month. Paige slowly turned toward me. The movement reminded me of someone finally looking up from their phone only to realize the building across the street was on fire. Robert leaned back in his chair. Megan's mouth fell slightly open. Garrett looked toward his mother with the expression of someone realizing the conversation had suddenly reached a level far beyond what he understood. By now, My mother's smile had disappeared completely. Her face had become unreadable. A blank wall where confidence had been only moments before. Catherine reached into her purse and removed a business card. Navy blue. Simple lettering. Across the bottom was the company slogan I'd spent 2 full days carefully choosing. Holloway Commercial Services. Excellence in every detail. She gently placed the card on the white tablecloth directly in front of my mother, perfectly centered and face up. Then she quietly asked, "You're that Julia?" It wasn't really a question. She already knew the answer. She asked it so Diane would hear it. "Yes, ma'am." Catherine looked first at my mother, then at my father, before returning her attention to me. When she spoke again, her voice carried through the room with the calm authority of someone giving sworn testimony. 18 months ago, my company signed a $3.8 million annual contract with Holloway Commercial Services to manage 47 buildings across 4 states.
She paused.
Julia personally presented that proposal in our boardroom. I watched my mother's face. Over the years, I'd seen Diane Holloway angry, heartbroken, dramatic, icy, and emotional. I'd watched her cry during school performances, argue with grocery store clerks, and deliver heartfelt speeches that left grown adults in tears. But I had never seen the expression that was beginning to appear on her face now.
I had seen my mother make people cry.
But in 32 years, I had never seen the color completely drain from her face. It began in her cheeks, then spread to her lips until she looked almost pale. The hand holding her wine glass tightened so hard that her knuckles turned white. Across the table, Gerald had frozen halfway through reaching for his drink, as though someone had paused the entire moment. Paige simply stared at me, her lips slightly parted. The diamond on her engagement ring sparkled under the lights, but she wasn't even looking at it anymore. Grandma Ruth remained perfectly still. She didn't say a word. She only looked at Diane with an expression I had never understood until that very moment. It was patience. The kind of patience that comes from spending years watching a lie survive, knowing that one day the truth would finally catch up with it. For 4 long seconds, no one spoke. Then the room exploded with questions. Garrett leaned across the table. "Wait, Julia, you own a company?" 14 states. Megan repeated in disbelief. Uncle Tom turned toward my father. "Gerald, did you actually know about this?" Robert Ellsworth placed his napkin neatly beside his plate and looked at my father the same way an executive looks at a coworker who has just been exposed during a board meeting. "Gerald, a few minutes ago you said you'd given up on her." My father lifted his wine glass, took a slow drink, and stayed silent. Diane recovered first. She always did. After 3 decades of controlling every story in Carver, Indiana, she wasn't about to surrender in a single evening. Leaning slightly forward, she folded her hands together and adopted a new voice, warmer, softer, carefully wrapped in surprise. "Well, Julia never told us her company had grown that much. She's always been a very private person. We honestly had no idea." Then she looked at Catherine with perfectly rehearsed amazement. "I always knew she'd be successful." I quietly set my fork on my plate. "You did know, Mom." She looked at me. "I told you when the company was 3 years old, and again when it turned 5. I could still remember exactly what she'd said. "So, how many people are you sending out to mop floors these days?" For just a fraction of a second, her expression hardened before she quickly smoothed it over. "I never said that." Before I could answer, Grandma Ruth spoke from the end of the table. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm.
Certain.
Final. "You did say it, Diane. You were on speakerphone. I was sitting right there." She delivered those words with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 78 years saving the truth until the exact moment it mattered most. Gerald reached toward the bread basket. His fingers rested on a dinner roll, but he never picked it up. He simply held it there, looking like a man who had forgotten why he'd reached for it in the first place. Right on cue, my mother's eyes filled with tears. Exactly as expected. She pressed her napkin to her lips and took a shaky breath, the kind designed to pull every eye back toward her. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "At your own sister's engagement dinner." Tonight isn't supposed to be about you, Julia. Then she turned toward Catherine. Her tone shifted once again. Gentler. More personal. Mother to mother.
I'm so sorry.
She lightly dabbed at her eyes. Families can be incredibly complicated. We've always done our best to support both of our daughters. We truly have. Almost automatically, Paige reached for her mother's arm. It was instinct. The golden child responding exactly as she'd been taught. I didn't react. I didn't bring any of this up, Mom. You introduced me. Catherine asked me questions. I simply answered them. Paige slowly lowered her hand. She looked directly at me. Can we please stop? She pleaded. This is supposed to be my night. Her voice trembled, not with cruelty, but with panic. Why do you always have to make everything about yourself? I looked at her calmly.
Paige.
I've been sitting here quietly eating salmon. I didn't stand up and make a speech. I didn't interrupt anyone. I answered a direct question. Catherine spoke next. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Authority did the work for her. Paige, no one here is trying to ruin your evening. She folded her hands neatly on the table. But your mother made very specific statements about your sister in front of my family, and those statements were false. She paused. In my experience, facts aren't the same thing as drama. The room fell silent again. Megan slowly reached for her glass of water. Robert remained perfectly still. Garrett looked toward his mother with an expression caught somewhere between admiration and fear. At the end of the table, Grandma Ruth sat quietly in her wheelchair, watching her daughter the way someone watches a house they warned everyone about finally burst into flames. Trying to ease the tension, Gerald forced a laugh. Well, this has certainly turned into quite a dinner show. His chuckle landed with all the warmth of a coin hitting the floor of a silent church. No one laughed. Realizing the joke had failed, he straightened in his chair and switched to the calm, reasonable tone he used during difficult insurance meetings. Julia, look. We honestly didn't know. You could have told us. We're not mind readers. I met his eyes. I did tell you, Dad. 3 different times. Eventually, you stopped listening. So, I stopped talking. Robert Ellsworth leaned slightly forward. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet honesty. He looked like a man preparing to say something that everyone at the table needed to hear. Robert leaned forward slightly. His expression wasn't judgmental. It was simply the look of a man unwilling to pretend he understood something he clearly didn't. Gerald, he said, I have to admit, if one of my children had built an $18 million company, I'd be telling everyone in this room about it. Gerald's jaw immediately tightened. The comment struck the one place he'd spent 30 years trying to protect. His average career. The same job title. 3 decades spent convincing himself that the insurance desk was enough. Robert hadn't intended to expose any of that. He had only spoken honestly. But the truth becomes shrapnel when it lands too close to someone's deepest insecurity. Catherine spoke next, her voice calm but unmistakably precise. Julia's company has the highest employee retention rate of any contractor we work with, 87%. She looked directly at me. She's created something truly exceptional. Before anyone else could respond, Diane interrupted. Well, maybe she should have told us. How are we supposed to know if she never said anything? From the opposite end of the table came Grandma Ruth's voice. It wasn't loud. It never needed to be. Everyone already understood the weight her words carried.
She did tell you, Diane.
You simply chose not to listen. For the first time that evening, I saw something on my mother's face I'd never witnessed before. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The room slowly split into several quiet conversations. Garrett leaned toward Paige and whispered. Robert calmly refilled Catherine's water glass. Uncle Tom excused himself to use the restroom and stayed away long enough that I suspected he was calling his wife. Then Diane stood. She straightened her dress and walked toward the hallway. Stopping beside my chair without making eye contact, she quietly said, "Come with me." I followed. Not because she'd ordered me to. Because I'd rather hear whatever she wanted to say without 23 people listening. The hallway was silent. The watercolor painting of the old barn still hung on the wall, watching us like an unmoving witness. Diane turned to face me. The tears had completely vanished. Her eyes were dry, cold, focused. You planned this. You came here to embarrass me. I shook my head. I came because Grandma Ruth invited me. Don't use my mother as an excuse. You knew Catherine would be here. You knew she'd recognize you. You set this entire thing up. I didn't arrange anything, Mom. I showed up. I sat down. I ate dinner. You're the one who introduced me as the family's cleaning lady. Her jaw tightened. She changed tactics. None of this changes who you really are. You're still the girl who chose to scrub toilets instead of getting a real education. I have a college degree, I answered calmly. I simply chose a different career. You're the one who decided to pretend it didn't exist. Her voice sharpened. After everything I sacrificed for you, everything I gave up, I nodded. You sacrificed your own career. I know. You remind me every time we talk. But that was your decision, Mom. This is mine. Her eyes narrowed. If you walk away from this family, you'll have nothing. I looked at her quietly. This was the woman who had traded her calculator for a kitchen. She had never truly accepted that choice. And she had spent years punishing me simply because I'd chosen differently. No, I replied. I'll have exactly what I already have. A company. 283 employees. And a grandmother who actually knows who I am. She flinched, only slightly. Then she straightened her shoulders, put the mask back on, and walked into the dining room. Diane Holloway had never allowed herself to leave a public room looking defeated, no matter what happened behind closed doors. Before I could follow her inside, Paige stopped me. She was crying. Real tears. I knew the difference. My mother's tears always arrived with perfect timing and direct eye contact. Paige's mascara was running, and her voice kept breaking in places she couldn't control. Why didn't you ever tell me? She asked. I'm your sister. I leaned against the hallway wall. Paige, when was the last time you actually asked me about my life? Not texted me about holiday plans. Actually asked. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. No words came. I'm not angry with you, I said gently. You believed what Mom told you because believing her was easier than finding out the truth. She looked down. I thought you were struggling. Mom said you. She couldn't finish. Mom believed what she needed to believe, I replied. And you never questioned it. She slowly leaned back against the opposite wall. Only 4 feet separated us. It was the closest we'd stood to each other in years. At the same time, we never felt farther apart. After a long silence, she looked up. So it's true? 14 states. I nodded. 14 states. 283 employees who show up every morning because what we do matters. And one grandmother who calls me every Sunday just to ask how everything is going. Paige's face crumpled. Not from embarrassment. From something much heavier. The realization that she'd handed over her entire relationship with her sister to a woman who had spent 10 years rewriting both of our stories. She didn't apologize. Not yet. She wasn't ready for that word. But she also didn't defend our mother. And in this family, choosing silence instead of defending Diane was its own kind of turning point. In our family, even staying silent instead of defending Diane was considered its own quiet act of rebellion. I returned to the dining room. About a minute later, Paige came back as well, her eyes red from crying, a napkin pressed against her face. This is the part of the story I almost decided to leave out. Because what I said after returning to that table changed my family forever. If this story reminds you of someone who deserves to hear the truth, share this video with them and stay until the end because the next few minutes changed everything. I walked back to my seat and stood behind my chair. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pound the table. I didn't straighten my shoulders like people do before delivering dramatic speeches in movies. I simply stood there. One hand rested on the back of my chair. The other stayed inside my pocket, my thumb gently rubbing the faded initials stitched into Grandma Ruth's handkerchief. Then I spoke. I'm only going to say this once. The room became completely still. Forks stopped moving. Coffee cups froze halfway to people's mouths. Even the server waiting near the doorway paused, balancing a tray of petit fours on her arm. I love my family. For the past 10 years, I've loved this family from a distance, because that was the only distance that allowed me to breathe. I turned toward my mother. Mom, tonight you introduced me as the daughter who cleans houses. Then I looked at my father. Dad, you told everyone here that you'd given up on me. I let those words hang in the air. Then I looked at Grandma Ruth. She was watching me with both hands resting calmly on the table.
Steady. Certain.
Her eyes shimmered with tears, but her chin never dropped. Grandma never gave up on me. She asked about my life. She listened. She showed up. I faced the rest of the table again. I'm not here to embarrass anyone. The only reason I came tonight is because my grandmother wanted me here. But I won't sit at another family table where my own parents describe me as less than who I really am. I took a slow breath. So this is what changes. I'll always answer Grandma's phone calls. I'll always come whenever she asks. But I won't attend family gatherings where I'm expected to pretend my life is smaller than it is. That's my boundary. It's not punishment. It's simply my decision. When I finished, I sat down, lifted my glass of water, and took a quiet sip. No one spoke. 5 full seconds passed. Then Diane broke the silence. She pushed herself to her feet so quickly that her chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. You can't just... Her voice cracked. She caught herself. Tried again. Lost it once more. You can't just walk away. I'm your mother. I met her eyes. Completely calm. Then act like one. 3 simple words. They hit the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction. This time, Diane's composure truly collapsed. Not the carefully rehearsed version. The real one. Her breathing became uneven. Her hands shook as they gripped the edge of the table. Tears streamed down her face. For the first time, I couldn't tell whether they were genuine or simply another performance. Maybe she couldn't tell anymore either. I gave up everything for this family, she cried. Everything. My career, my dreams, my...
She stopped.
Slowly looking around the room, she noticed the Ellsworth family watching. She saw Robert's expression. She saw Catherine's calm silence. And she realized she'd revealed far more than she'd intended in front of the very people she'd spent all evening trying to impress. Catherine finally spoke. Quietly. Diane, your daughter has built something remarkable. Maybe it's time you allowed yourself to see it. My mother's head snapped toward her. You don't know anything about our family. Without hesitation, Catherine answered. I know your daughter. That's enough. Gerald remained in his chair.
Silent.
He hadn't moved for several minutes. Just as he had survived 30 years of marriage, present physically, absent everywhere else that mattered. Then another voice cut through the room. Grandma Ruth.
Thin.
Gentle. Unshakable. Sit down, Diane. My mother obeyed. Not because she'd admitted she was wrong. Not because she'd surrendered. But because Ruth was still her mother. And even Diane Holloway, the woman who controlled every story and every tear, couldn't ignore that voice with 23 people watching. The entire room seemed to breathe again. I hadn't raised my voice once. Quietly, I stepped away from my chair and walked toward Grandma Ruth. She sat in her wheelchair with her hands folded peacefully in her lap. Her cardigan had slipped from one shoulder. Without thinking, I pulled it back into place. The way you automatically take care of the people you love.
Small.
Natural. Without needing to be asked. I knelt beside her. She reached out and held both of my hands. Her fingers were thin. Her knuckles swollen with age. Her skin cool and delicate. But her grip was still unmistakably Ruth. You don't have to stay because of me, sweetheart, she whispered softly enough that only I could hear. You came. That's enough. I'll call you on Sunday. Same time. I smiled. You'd better. I leaned forward and kissed her forehead. She smelled of lavender, wool, and the cedar closet where she kept the quilts she'd sewn decades earlier. As I stood, she quietly slipped something into my hand. A small folded piece of paper, small enough to disappear inside my palm. Without opening it, I closed my fingers around it. Then I turned toward Catherine. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellsworth, for asking the questions no one else ever did." Catherine gave a small, deliberate nod. "Thank you, Julia, for answering honestly." I reached behind my chair, picked up my purse, and prepared to leave. Before walking away, I opened the side pocket of my wallet, removed one of my business cards, and placed it gently beside my mother's plate. Navy blue. Simple lettering. Excellence in every detail. Some things are better left where people can't ignore them. Then I turned and walked out. My steps stayed steady, my flat shoes tapping softly against the hardwood floor. I didn't rush. I never looked back. Somewhere behind me I heard my mother beginning to speak again, her voice sharp, already piecing together the version of the evening she'd eventually tell her friends. But by then, I'd already passed the hostess stand. The restaurant door closed behind me with one quiet, final click. I drove for about 11 miles before pulling into the parking lot of a small white church. The lot was nearly empty. Only a single minivan sat near the back, probably belonging to the janitor. It felt like the kind of place people stop when whatever they're carrying has become too heavy to take home. I turned off the engine. The dashboard clock read 9:07 p.m. Outside, a lone security light cast a pale circle across the gravel. I slowly unfolded the note Grandma Ruth had slipped into my hand. It had been folded twice. Her handwriting shook with age and arthritis, each letter leaning slightly to the right as though pushing against the wind. Still, every word was perfectly clear. "Julia, I watched you build the life I always wished I'd had the courage to build myself. Your mother inherited my fear. You inherited my courage. I'm sorry it took me so many years to say that out loud. Don't waste your life waiting for them to finally see you. The people who truly matter already do. Love, Ruth." I read the note once, then again, then a third time, and finally, I cried. Not the beautiful, quiet kind of crying people describe in novels. I cried the ugly kind, bent over the steering wheel of my Honda Accord in the parking lot of a church I'd never even visited before. The engine was off. The windows slowly fogged over from the warmth of 10 years of grief, finally, finding somewhere to go. I reached into my wallet and pulled out Ruth's handkerchief. The faded initials. RH. Soft cotton worn smooth by a decade of carrying it everywhere. I pressed it against my face. It still smelled faintly of lavender, like the top drawer of Ruth's dresser, like the only person in my family who ever thought to ask how I was really doing. When I was 22, she'd given me $800. She'd given me that handkerchief when I had almost nothing.
And tonight,
she'd given me 17 handwritten lines that somehow said everything my parents never had. I stayed in that parking lot for another 20 minutes. Then I drove home. 48 hours later, the full aftermath began to unfold. My mother called 7 different times. Every call went to voicemail. The first 3 messages were filled with controlled anger. Short, sharp. The voice of someone convinced she'd been hurt by the very person she'd spent years hurting. "You embarrass me in front of the Ellsworths. In front of Catherine. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The next 2 messages sounded completely different. There were tears, long pauses, the sound of her blowing her nose. "I'm your mother. You can't just walk away from your own mother. That's not how families work." The final 2 voicemails contained almost nothing. Just 10 seconds of silence, followed by the click of the call ending. On Monday afternoon, Gerald sent a single text. "Your mother is very upset." I read it. I never replied. Sunday night, Paige sent me a message. "I'm sorry I never asked. Can we talk? Not about Mom, just about us." I read that one too. I didn't answer, but I didn't delete it either. Monday morning brought something unexpected. An email from Catherine Ellsworth. The subject line read, "Dinner and a contract." It said, "Julia, my son may be marrying into an interesting family, but thankfully he isn't marrying his mother-in-law. Your company continues to be our most valued partner. I'd love to have dinner sometime. Not for business. Just two women who understand what it costs to build something worthwhile. Catherine. I printed that email. Then I taped it to the wall of my office beside the very first dollar I'd ever earned cleaning that little dental office on Meridian Street. The following Sunday morning, right on schedule, my phone rang. Grandma Ruth. I answered before the third ring. How's my girl? I smiled. Better, Grandma. Still getting better. You read my note? Every single word. 3 times. Good, she replied. Now put it somewhere safe. And keep building.
So I did.
Monday morning at 7:15, I walked through the doors of Holloway Commercial Services on West Washington Street in Indianapolis. A 3,200 square foot office. An open floor plan. Glass conference rooms. And a break room that always smelled like Maria's coffee, strong enough to dissolve a spoon. Maria was already waiting for me in the hallway, holding 2 steaming mugs. She had been my very first employee, and she was still there. Maria had been my very first employee, my first real friend in this industry, and now she served as the regional manager for Central Indiana. She was 15 years older than I was, with a kind of confidence that came from never asking anyone for permission to succeed. She smiled the moment she saw me. Boss, you look like you survived a family dinner this weekend. I couldn't help laughing. Something like that. She handed me a steaming mug of coffee. I walked into my office, sat behind my desk, and opened my laptop. 312 unread emails. One immediately caught my attention. It was from Catherine Ellsworth's office. Contract renewal. A new 3-year agreement. Better pricing. Improved terms. Attached was a short note from Catherine's assistant. Mrs. Ellsworth asked that this be processed as quickly as possible. I leaned back in my chair. On my desk sat a small spray bottle filled with lemon juice, white vinegar, and water. The exact mixture I'd started making in my tiny studio apartment when I was 22 because I couldn't afford expensive cleaning products. I unscrewed the cap and took a deep breath. It smelled exactly the same.
Sharp. Fresh.
Familiar. The only difference was me. Older.
Calmer.
More certain. And responsible for 283 people who counted on me every morning. That night my mother had called me the daughter who cleans houses. She wasn't wrong about the cleaning. I do clean. We clean hospitals where children recover. We clean office buildings where careers are built. We clean courthouses where justice is served. We clean university classrooms where future generations prepare for tomorrow. There is absolutely nothing small about the work we do. On the corner of my desk sat a black metal frame. Inside it was the very first business card I had ever printed. Year 1. An awful font. Cheap cardstock. A logo I designed on a free website at 2 o'clock in the morning. I've never replaced it. It reminds me where everything began. 2 weeks after that dinner, I made one phone call. The only one I initiated. I called my mother. She answered before the second ring. She didn't say hello. She simply waited. Mom, I'm calling because I need to tell you something. Silence. I love you. That hasn't changed, but I won't attend another family gathering where you or Dad introduce me as something less than what I've built. If that means I miss holidays, then I'll miss them. If it means we see each other less often, then that's what will happen. This isn't punishment. It's a boundary. She answered immediately. You're choosing your pride over your family. I spoke quietly. No, Mom. I'm choosing my peace. Those aren't the same thing. After a pause, I added,